Good day, ladies and gentlemen. You're about to watch the first video in a series on creation and evolution, creation according to the traditional Catholic perspective. And this is the first episode with Hugh Owen, who runs the Kolbe Center. More information about that in the video. As a quick note, sometimes his camera did cut out, but his audio was clean the whole time, so it's still very watchable and easy to listen to. When you talk about these topics, sometimes the gremlins kind of get into your technology. So I apologize for that. I think you'll enjoy it. So have a good time watching this and stay tuned for episodes coming up in the series because there are a number of them. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our first installment of our series here on my channel and podcast on the traditional doctrine of creation in the doctrines of the Catholic Church. This is something that's a great passion of mine. And maybe Hugh, this is Hugh Owen, by the way, I should introduce him. Hugh Owen is the leader of the Kolbe Center. And maybe Hugh doesn't know this, but the Kolbe Center was one of the first places I was ever actually published. I don't know if you remember this, Hugh. It was in, I think, 2019. Yes. Yeah. And I wrote an article on how the sort of philosophy behind evolutionism contributed to the problem of effeminacy in men. Kind of a niche topic, but what better place than the Kolbe Center to put it up? And he did, and that was a great help for me. So, Hugh, it's a pleasure for you to have you on my show finally.
Oh, it's a great joy for me, too.
And so we're going to do, this is the first episode in a 7-part series where we go over the, big topics that have to do with creation and the Catholic faith, evolutionism, and so forth. And since it's the first one, why don't you introduce for us what the Kolbe Center is, your mission, and sort of what it's all about?
Certainly. Well, it helps to give a little bit of my personal background. My father was the son of a Baptist minister in Wales and was brought up in a very conservative Baptist home. But when he went to university in the 1920s, early 30s, already secular humanism reigned supreme, and his professors taught him and his fellow students that we don't need the fairy tales in the book of Genesis anymore because science can explain everything. Science could explain the origins of man in the universe through evolution, and there was no need to appeal to God or to any supernatural agency. And so, like millions of other people then and now, my dad was completely robbed of his faith in traditional Christianity, and he became a secular humanist and then went to work for the United Nations, became an assistant secretary general, co-administrator of the United Nations Development Program. And then after 25 years with the UN, he was knighted by the Queen of England, who died recently, and retired rather disillusioned because he looked at the world and saw that all the problems of the world were much worse than when the United Nations was founded. Why was that? Well, once again, he turned to the intelligentsia that he knew, and they had the answer. They said the reason the United Nations is not making headway in solving the world's problems is it's not going to the root of the world's problems, which is overpopulation. Too many people, that's why we have wars and economic and social problems and pollution and everything else. So they said, cut down on the number of people, then we'll have enough to go around. All our problems will be solved. So once again, my dad deferred to the consensus among the intellectual elite that he knew, and he accepted to become the first ever Secretary General of International Planned Parenthood Federation at the very time when IPPF changed its public position on abortion and became the world's #1 promoter of abortion as well as contraception and sex education. And my dad held that position for just about a year when he died unexpectedly of a heart attack in London when I was just 16 years old. Now, his death precipitated my conversion to the Catholic faith, and I won't go into all the details of that, but suffice it to say that less than 2 years after my father's death, I was baptized, confirmed, and made my first Holy Communion as a Catholic in the Princeton University Chapel, where I was enrolled as a freshman at the age of 18. And at that time, the chaplains for the Catholic students at Princeton were Jesuit priests. And so they gave me a book to learn the doctrines of the Catholic faith, of which I knew nothing. And the book that they gave me was the infamous Dutch Catechism, but we call it the Dutch Cataclysm because that is the book that has practically annihilated the Catholic faith in the Netherlands, which once had a vibrant Catholic community that sent a disproportionate number of missionaries all over the world, including here to the United States, who gave their lives to spread the true faith. But there's a theme that runs through this Dutch cataclysm, which very much reflects the mentality, the thinking of the Jesuit priests who received me into the church. And it's this, it's that we live in a scientific age, and science has enlightened us to understand everything in our faith in a new and deeper way. Sounds wonderful. But then Father Schillebeeckx and company proceed to sow doubt in the mind of the reader about everything you can imagine, from the existence of angels, the reality of Satan, the historical existence of Adam and Eve, original sin, the virgin birth of our Lord Jesus Christ, his bodily resurrection, the intrinsic evil of contraception, and on and on and on. So that it's a miracle that I survived the Dutch cataclysm and came into the church at all. But somewhere in the depths of my soul, I could never accept this idea that science would discover anything new that is true that would contradict any authoritative teaching that had been handed down from the apostles. And I was delighted eventually to discover that at the very time when my father was being robbed of his faith, because there was nobody in his environment to tell him the other side of the story about evolution, St. Maximilian Kolbe was writing articles and sending them all over the world, showing that the emperor of evolution was not wearing any clothes, that there wasn't any sound scientific evidence for this idea that matter came alive and turned into all the different kinds of living things and finally into human beings through the same kinds of material processes that are going on now. And so in obedience to the magisterium, specifically to the exhortation of Pope Pius XII in the encyclical Humani Generis, for Catholic scholars to examine the evidence for and against the evolutionary hypothesis in light of the deposit of faith, we founded the Kolbe Center for the Study of Creation on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, our principal patroness, in the Jubilee year 2000. And so the Kolbe Center attempts to do what Pope Pius XII asked to be done back in 1950, but which had not been done as late as 50 years thereafter, to provide a forum for Catholic theologians, philosophers, and natural scientists who defend the traditional teaching of the Church on creation and who expose the fatal flaws in the alternative accounts of the origins of man in the universe. And so that's our mission, and that's what we've been doing during the last going on 24 years. It's very important, though, for our viewers, listeners, to understand that we do not pass judgment on those who have deviated from this teaching. It isn't our job. We are not the bishops of the church. It is not our job to declare that such and such a person is a heretic or anything like that. But even as lay people, and of course some of our members and advisors are priests, they're not all, and bishops, they're not all lay people, but even as lay people, we not only have the right, but the duty to defend what was handed down to us, what is the deposit of faith. And so what we do is we show what the church has taught authoritatively in regard to creation and the early history of the world from the time of the apostles. And then we show that there is absolutely no compelling reason, no evidence whatsoever in the realm of theology, philosophy, or natural science that would justify abandoning this apostolic teaching. And so that's what we do, and we obey legitimate church authority in everything but sin. But we recognize that when Vatican I defined papal infallibility, for example, the Council Fathers and the Pope defined it very precisely, and they say that this gift is not given to the Pope to define any new doctrine, but only to define a doctrine of faith or morals that is contained in the deposit of faith that was handed down from the apostles. And so, what we can show and what we'll be talking about during this session is the mountain of very authoritative church teaching that is not compatible with a theistic evolution or progressive creation. And then we show that any statements that have been made by popes or church leaders that have been favorable to molecules to man evolution in its theistic form have never been made as anything more than opinions about a hypothesis in natural science. There is not a single magisterial teaching that finds molecules to man evolution in the deposit of faith. So, our position is if we have studied the relevant information in the realm of theology, philosophy, and natural science with the help of competent experts, and we can prove that there is no compelling reason that has ever been offered in any of these realms why we should abandon the doctrine of creation and the interpretation of the sacred history of Genesis that was handed down to us, then it is not only our right, but our obligation to defend that doctrine and to defend that interpretation and to respectfully appeal to the church authorities to, to restore and to reaffirm this fundamental doctrine.
Yeah, that's excellent. And two things, a couple quotes. One quote from G.K. Chesterton came to mind as you said the overpopulation thing. This is G.K. Chesterton's famous, one-liner. He's got so many of them about overpopulation, and he says, the answer to anyone who talks about the surplus population is to ask him whether he is the surplus population, or if he is not,
Of course.
how he knows he is not. I love everyone else is too much population, but not me. I'm the smart person in the ivory tower. And I want to share on the screen here paragraph 36 of Humani Generis, which is the key to what you're talking about here. And this is sadly a paragraph that is used, I would say, at best improperly, at worst dishonestly, by those who push a sort of theistic evolution agenda within Catholic apologetics, because this is the last solemn statement. Solemn meaning, okay, is it infallible? Well, there are many degrees of things that we must assent to before we get to infallibility. For a background on that, I would recommend everyone look up what is considered the theological notes. My friend Tim Flanders has a good summary of that on his website at Meaning of Catholic. You see, there's about 6 levels. The top 4, not all of them are infallible, but you pretty much have, the top 2 are, but even numbers 3 and 4, you can maybe interiorly disagree a little bit here and there for grave reason, but to go out and teach against those things is not acceptable. I'm just going to share that just right here from, one second here, make this bigger. Good. And this is, I'll read it on the screen here. We'll just cover our faces for a second, then I'll bring it down. This is paragraph 36 of Humani Generis, which is the last authoritative, meaning something actually put out in the proper ways to actually teach the faith to Catholics. So it's important to understand this. And it says, for these reasons, the teaching authority of the Church does not forbid that, in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, that's important, research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields takes place with regard to the doctrine of creation, in as far as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. For the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. However, this must be done in such a way that the reasons for both opinions, that is, those favorable and those unfavorable to evolution, be weighed and judged with the necessary seriousness, moderation, and measure, and provided that all are prepared to submit to the judgment of the church, to whom Christ has given the mission of interpreting authentically the sacred scriptures and the defending of dogmas of the faith. Some, however, and this is very important, rashly transgress this liberty of discussion when they act as if the origin of the human body from pre-existing and living matter were already completely certain and proved by the facts which have been discovered up to now and by reasoning of those facts, and as if there were nothing in the sources of divine revelation which demands the greatest moderation and caution in this question. So, even if we look to this statement, Pius XII is allowing very moderated, very measured discussion into the origin of if there is pre-existing matter in the creation of the human person. Now, that is totally reconcilable with Scripture, because we read in Scripture that God creates Adam out of the slime, the dust, the soil, whatever of the earth. That's a pre-existing thing. It's okay to say, let's investigate into that. That's totally fine. It's another thing to say we have 150,000 years of various types of hominids who are, doing their hominid thing, and then Adam is essentially the offspring of some type of ape. That is not part of the discussion. And even if someone were to fall on the side of being more liberal with their personal opinion about it, he talks about measured and moderate discussions, not teaching as if it is doctrine. And I think that's very important for people to understand. If you have anything to add to that, you can now, or you can please continue with your presentation.
Yes, well, I would like to just add two things that follow on what you said. The first is that there are other points that Pope Pius XII makes in Humani Generis, which are very important to always remember in relation to paragraph 36 that you just read. He says in Humani Generis that the bishops must teach that everything in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis is true history. This is very important because that was the teaching of all the fathers and doctors of the church from the time of the apostles. And then he says that that all bishops and theologians must teach that every word in the Bible is true, whether it's talking about faith, morals, history, natural science, or anything else. Now, take those 2 points together, and you have very, very strict parameters within which to conduct the discussion that's called for in paragraph 36, because you must hold that Genesis is not a myth, not a poem, not an allegory. It's a sacred history. And you must hold that every historical fact that is related is true, because we are required to believe that there is no error in the Bible whatsoever. And I've had so many funny experiences in this apostolate, and one of the most remarkable ones, perhaps in a certain way, was when I was in Europe a few years ago, and there was a fairly prominent Catholic pro-life doctor who wanted to have a debate with me and have it videotaped because he was alarmed at what the Kolbe Center was teaching, and he was convinced that evolution is true and that we were bringing disgrace on the church by defending this antiquated doctrine. And so at the very beginning of the debate, he accused me on the tape of being guilty of a serious heresy because I was contesting evolution, contesting theistic evolution. And very soon after that, he said to me, of course, that there are many errors in the Bible, as his way of dismissing the fact that we were defending the literal historical truth of Genesis chapters 1 to 11, as every father and doctor of the church had done from the time of the apostles. So here he was, and a very prominent man in the pro-life movement in his country, calling me a heretic because I didn't accept theistic evolution, meaning that I hadn't assented to the personal opinions of Pope St. John Paul II in regard to evolution, and then saying to me that, of course, I had to know that there were many errors in the Bible when Vatican Council I had dogmatically defined, once again, of course, that there were no errors in the Bible whatsoever. So it's just, this is the kind of madness that is going on today. But the other point that I want to make is that in Humani Generis, the the Pope also says something very important. He says, speculation is fruitless. Examination of the deposit of faith is fruitful. Now, that is so amazing because when you get into this subject, you soon discover that evolution, whether in its atheistic form or theistic evolution, it's it's 95% speculation. The facts do not support the hypothesis, so there has to be all kinds of conjecture and speculation to connect the dots in such a way that they seem to fit together with the evolutionary hypothesis. But this is important also in the sense that we find again and again that so many Catholic intellectuals take the position that because the Pope said that there can be a discussion of the pros and cons of human evolution, that this somehow makes the two positions equal. We see this all the time, just as we find so many Catholic intellectuals who say, well, because the Pontifical Biblical Commission in 1909, when it was an arm of the magisterium, because it allowed scholars to argue, discuss whether day in Genesis 1 means a 24-hour day or an indefinite period of time. Therefore, these two positions are equal. But that doesn't follow at all if you take Humani Generis as a whole, and if you take the decrees of the PBC on Genesis 1, 2, 3 as a whole, and then look at that particular one in context, you realize that the magisterium has never been saying that theistic evolution and special creation are equals. The burden of proof has always been on the person who challenges the traditional teaching. And this is something that we really want to emphasize. And as an example of somebody who understood the importance of this point, we like to remind, especially our American viewers, listeners, readers, that in the entire history of the Catholic Church in this country, there is one man who was probably the most outstanding lay apologist in the history of our country, and that was Orestes Brownson, who was a self educated man from New England who was so gifted that he became part of this elite circle of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and their like. But he, being a true seeker of truth, thought his way and of course prayed his way eventually into the Catholic Church and astonished the Brahmins of this intellectual elite in New England when he left them to become a Catholic. And then he founded a review where he did magnificent work in apologetics, so much so that when the bishops of the entire United States met in synod in the early 1850s, every single one of them signed a letter to Orestes Brownson congratulating him on his work in defense of the Catholic faith. Now, just a few years after that letter was written to him, Darwin, of course, came out with his book Origin of Species in 1859. And when you look at how Orestes Brownson responded to Darwin's books, Origin of Species and The Descent of Man, he shows us how every Catholic intellectual and every church leader should have responded to Darwin. Because what Brownson says to Darwin in so many words is, Mr. Darwin, you are contradicting the teaching of the entire Christian world. And if you want us to take you seriously, when you contradict the origins of man and the universe that has been continuously held throughout the entire Christian world from the time of our Lord Jesus Christ, you cannot expect us to take you seriously if you simply say, well, it could have been this way, or it might have been this other way, or it could have been this other way. No. If you want us to take you seriously, you have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt for your hypothesis. And if you don't, we should not give you the time of day. That is exactly the way every Catholic intellectual should have responded to Darwin's challenge to the traditional Christian doctrine of creation. And if the intellectual elite of the Catholic Church had responded the way Brownson did, we would not be in the mess that we're in today, because St. Pius X told us in Pascendi that we are now dealing with the worst heresy in the history of Christianity, modernism. And what is its principal doctrine? It's evolution. The idea that there are no stable natures, there is no absolute truth, everything is evolving, and therefore our liturgy, our marriage law, our morality, everything has to be changed to adapt to the stage of evolution that we've reached. My bottom line point is, we are not going to allow the burden of proof to be placed on us when we are defending what the apostles, fathers, and doctors taught on creation and the early history of the world. We refuse. The burden of proof to this day remains where it will always rest, and that is on anybody who challenges the doctrine of creation and the interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11 that was upheld and maintained by every father, doctor, pope, and council father in their authoritative teaching.
So the point of Pascendi and evolution is extremely important, because I'm writing a book on modernism right now, actually, and it's basically an exegesis of Pascendi. It should be out maybe later this year, more likely later this year, early next year, with Sophia Press. And what I'm essentially doing is I'm basically going through the encyclical Pascendi, which is a masterpiece. It's an absolute. I mean, it's one of the greatest things ever written by any Catholic leader, and it's painstakingly detailed, which is why I'm trying to tease out the meaning for, let's say, the lay common reader. You know, we have to remember he was writing this encyclical for bishops that were educated in a classical system in the 1800s. These men had a much more rich theological and philosophical vocabulary than the average person does today, including myself, which is why I've had to read it so many times. And so I'm trying to break it down. But evolution is at the heart of the philosophical mindset behind modernism. People will say, well, that's evolution of dogma, not necessarily evolution of creatures. But the problem there is that if there are dogmas that attest to a special creation, then that does pose a problem, because it's evolution in thought, which then leads us to look at the world with our evolved thoughts, so to speak, and find something that is contrary to sacred history. Furthermore, all of these heresies begin in the ideas. So if we've already begun with this mindset that the substrate, the nature of being, let's call it, is in a state of flux and change, we can say we want to relegate that to the philosophical all we want, but that heresy of thought is going to go into everything else we do. And people need to understand as well, as we continue this series, scientists are not infallible. In fact, science, in a sense, kind of historically has rejected the idea that science could be infallible, because it's under this presupposition that you can always be retesting things to find out if you're actually true or not. So even if someone 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 10 minutes ago says, this is how I see the material world, and this seems true to me, it is our duty to test that thing. And when we look into the history of whether it's the ancient earth sort of cosmologists like Father Lemaitre, who was a Catholic priest, I'm not accusing him of any heresy or anything like that. I'm just saying he was a Catholic priest who did it. Okay, fine. But even his dates have been changed by tens of billions, depending on which scholar is looking at it. And I always make the joke, I say, if my accountant loses $10, I'm probably going to find a new accountant I don't know why we're accepting the claims of these astrophysicists and physicists who lose 10 billion years and we just sort of brush it off. So we have to understand there are major problems here. So we have to go with what is certain, and that is the dogmas of the faith, which you're laying out for us here.
Yes, and another very important point is that in Humani Generis, Pope Pius XII not only says that the fruitful scholarship is going to be examination of what's in the deposit of faith, but he also says that scholars must apply the metaphysical principles of traditional Catholic philosophy to their examination of evolution, because these are fundamental principles of common sense which never change. So any system of thought that violates any of these principles is bogus. And as you know, and many of our viewers and listeners know, Father Chad Ripperger was one of the first Catholic scholars to actually obey Pope Pius XII and write a book, Metaphysics and Evolution, in which he does what Pope Pius XII and later Pope St. John Paul II in Fides et Ratio asked Catholic scholars to do. And he takes the metaphysical principles of traditional Catholic philosophy and applies them to the evolutionary hypothesis and proves that they flunk the test. And because there are other very, very important points that I think I should address during our conversation today, I don't want to try to go through all the principles in Father Ripperger's book, but I would like to just show how the application of one of these metaphysical principles suffices to show that evolution is bogus by the criteria that Pope Pius XII gave Catholic scholars and that Pope St. John Paul II in Fides et Ratio also affirmed. And so the principle that I like to use when I only have time, which is usually the case for one, is the principle that no effect is greater than its cause. This is something that everybody practices in everyday life. Anybody who didn't live by this principle would be locked up. And it's not saying anything more than that if I have a balance scale and I put a 10-pound weight over here and I put a 5-pound weight over here, it's not going to balance, because if it did, the effect putting 5 pounds opposite 10 pounds would be greater than the cause. The effect balancing the scale would be greater than the cause, which is putting 5 pounds opposite 10 pounds. Now, Father Ripperger shows that if you look at the traditional doctrine of creation, what was handed down from the apostles and believed and taught by all the fathers, doctors, popes, and councils in their authoritative teaching, there's no contradiction, because God, who is the supreme being, brings into existence from nothing all the different kinds of creatures, which are much lower in being than he is. So the effect is never greater than the cause. But when Father Ripperger examines the evolutionary hypothesis, all of a sudden we realize that literally from beginning to end, it's one continuous series of violations of this fundamental principle. Because we'll skip over the fact that you get something from nothing, because the theistic evolutionists are willing to grant that God had to do that. But now most of them hold that once God had created the matter and some natural laws 13.7 billion years ago, that matter came alive through the same kinds of material processes that are going on now. And then the one-celled organism turned into the multi-celled, which is again the effect being greater than the cause. The non-swimmer produces the swimmer produces the walker produces the flyer and the thinker. Literally from beginning to end, evolution is a continuous series of violations of a fundamental principle which Pope Pius XII and Pope St. John Paul II and the entire tradition of the Church tells us cannot be violated even once by any sound system of thought. So if any of the readers, viewers, listeners want to investigate the subject in more depth, you can go to our website, www.kolbecenter.org, and you can get Father Ippiger's book as a PDF or as in the printed form, and you will see he makes an absolutely airtight, overwhelming case that evolution fails the test that Pope Pius XII gives in Humani Generis to when you apply the metaphysical principles of traditional Catholic philosophy to the evolutionary hypothesis. And to just give one other example of, of how glaring the failure is when you apply this particular principle to evolution in its common theistic evolutionary form as well as in its atheistic form. When you look at the problem of getting life from non life, Dr. Rob Stadler, whose background is with MIT and who's one of the world's leading experts on the origin of life, he shows that there are actually 12 impossible hurdles that you have to overcome to get from non life to life. And he shows that in all the scientific literature, nobody has even come close to showing how a single one of these hurdles could ever be or has ever been overcome in the natural world. All the origin of life experiments are in very artificial conditions where people with intelligence do all kinds of things to give themselves the right kind of ingredients to try to make something like the building blocks of life. And even then, they fail miserably. They can't even get close to creating anything like even the building blocks of life. So here you have a very glaring example of where there's absolutely no evidence in nature or in the laboratory for how non living matter came alive through the same material processes that are going on now or that were ever possible in the past. And yet, in most of our Catholic schools and universities, we are paying people good money to teach our children and grandchildren that this is what happened. It's
Yes.
absolutely unbelievable. So, by the criteria that Pope Pius XII gives us in Humani Generis, evolution is dead and it should be discarded. And it's only a matter of time before, by the grace of God, there's going to be some kind of public recognition of that fact by the church leadership.
Mhm.
But in the meantime, we just encourage everyone to take advantage of Father Ripperger's work, and you judge for yourself whether he's made his case. And I think you'll be entirely convinced that he did, because the only way that the evolutionists have been able to counter Father Ripperger's work is by saying something like, well, of course, we're not like Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
We don't think that the reptile turned into the bird, all by itself without some je ne sais quoi, something of God that has to be injected into it. But then, of course, at that point, these people are not talking about natural science. The minute that they have to invoke God to make evolution work, they're not dealing with science, they're dealing with religion.
That's right.
And if they're going to recognize that they have to invoke God, why not just accept what God told us about how he created the world in the first place? It doesn't make any sense. So going to the deposit of faith, having shown that the metaphysical principles of traditional Catholic philosophy are really not compatible with evolution, we find that there is a mountain of authoritative teaching that tells us that we should believe that God gave us a literal historical account of how he actually created the world and what happened in the first period of human history. Because every father and doctor of the church, without exception, believed and taught and would have shed his last drop of blood for the proposition that Genesis is a sacred history, that Moses wrote or redacted the first 5 books of the Bible, and that all the factual information in the first 11 chapters of Genesis is true, whether it's talking about Adam living to be 930 years old, Eve being created from Adam's side, or any other fact that is set forth in the sacred history of Genesis. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't also allegorical meanings or spiritual meanings that can be uh, developed on the basis of the literal historical truth of the text. For example, all the fathers recognized that Adam was literally created, body and soul, instantly and immediately by God from the virgin earth.
Mm.
And they saw that that was a foreshadowing of our Lord Jesus Christ, the last Adam, taking his sacred humanity from the virgin's womb. So the first Adam was formed from the virgin earth, not an earth that was full of the fossils of dead, diseased, and decayed creatures over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, a virgin earth. And that was a foreshadowing of the uh, Lord, our Lord, taking his sacred humanity from the womb of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And every father and doctor of the church believed and taught that God literally formed Eve from Adam's side and created her instantly and immediately from Adam's body. But they also, of course, held that that foreshadowed the birth of the Immaculate Bride of Christ, the church, from his side when he slept the sleep of death on the cross for us on Good Friday. So, yes, there were always beautiful spiritual interpretations that were developed from the literal historical, a literal and obvious meaning of the text of the sacred history of Genesis. But these spiritual meanings were only powerful because the facts from which they were derived were true. The things that they were based upon actually happened. And every father and every doctor of the church believed and taught that God created all of the different kinds of creatures instantly and immediately for us in our first parents. We would say, in view of the incarnation and the Immaculate Conception, and that when God finished creating Adam and Eve, he stopped creating new kinds of creatures because he created everything for us. And he placed Saint Adam and Saint Eve as the king and queen of a perfectly beautiful, complete, and harmonious universe that was totally free, not only from human death, but from deformity, disease, or any disorder of that kind. And that it was only the original sin of Adam that brought the death, deformity, and disease not only into this earth, but to the entire universe, because all the fathers and doctors believed and taught with St. Paul in Romans 8, that the original sin of Adam on this earth made the entire creation, the entire universe, subject to a mysterious bondage to decay, because this earth is the capital of the entire created universe. And so these tenets have been taught at the highest level of authority from the beginning of the church. If you look at the Roman Catechism, the Catechism of Trent, which is the most authoritative catechism in the history of the Catholic Church, the gold standard for teaching and preaching the dogmas of the faith in the entire world for 350 years, still authoritative, the only catechism that's quoted in the New Catechism because it gives such beautiful, clear definitions of the dogmas of the faith. You'll see that the Catechism of Trent clearly teaches that God created all the different kinds of creatures supernaturally by willing them into existence in 6 days. And that on the seventh day, he consecrated that seventh day to himself at the beginning of the world, and he stopped creating new kinds of creatures. So that everything that has happened from the completion of the work of creation on the sixth day after God had created St. Adam and St. Eve has been only a development from those things that were created by God in the beginning. And all of that development has been what we should call devolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, God created some wolf kind of creature, and from that wolf kind of creature have come every kind of wolf and every breed of dog from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane. But that is not evolution, because all the genetic potential to produce every breed of dog and every species of wolf and perhaps hyenas and coyotes, it was all present in the genome of that original wolf kind of creature. And the same thing is true of all the different kinds of plants and animals. Any species that exist on Earth today have descended from those first kinds of creatures. So St. Thomas recognizes that the mule was not created during the 6 days of creation, but the mule is a devolutionary development and it's sterile. And yet the theistic evolutionists will use that as an example of how St. Thomas supposedly is supportive of the concept of evolution. That's
Yeah.
not evolution. Evolution requires new functions, new organs, new functional biological information has to come into existence through a material process. And there is no evidence that that has ever happened. So the scientific evidence is 100% harmonious with the traditional reading of Genesis that was maintained by all the fathers, doctors, popes, and council fathers in their authoritative teaching.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm actually going to pull up here. If I have it. There you go. This is from the First Vatican Council. Speaking of infallible things, there's an anathema attached, which is kind of a big deal. And I'll just make that a little bigger for people to see here. So this is one of the canons, and it's on God, creator of all things. And it says very clearly, if anyone denies, here it is. If anyone says that finite things, both corporeal and spiritual, or at any rate spiritual, emanated from the divine substance, or that the divine essence, by the manifestation of evolution of itself, becomes all things, or finally that God is a universal or indefinite being by which self-determination establishes the totality of things distinct in genera, species, and individuals, let him be anathema. This basically puts away the possibility of something like a pantheism, which is very closely linked to theistic evolution. And the next one is very important. It says, if anyone does not confess that the world and all things which are contained in it, both spiritual and material, were produced according to their whole substance out of nothing by God, or holds that God did not create by his free will from all necessity, but as necessarily as he necessarily loves himself, which is sort of Neoplatonism in a sense, or denies that the world was created for the glory of God, let him be anathema. A couple things here are really important. Whole substance. We're going to do a whole episode in our next recording about sort of the Thomistic underpinnings of creation versus evolution, which we'll get into these terms, substance and essence and those kinds of things. That's very important to remember. But also, out of nothing, their whole substance out of nothing. I know that there are certain, Thomistic evolutionists will kind of play with words and kind of work around with that and, try to do some monkey business, pun intended, with this idea. But it's very clear. And Vatican I was a traditional ecumenical council in the sense that it wasn't like the Second Vatican Council where there are no anathemas and there's some ambiguity on the doctrinal nature of this and that. Vatican I was very clear, just like all the councils preceding it. Where there was an anathema, this carries the full weight and power and solemn judgment of the highest teaching office in the church. And it is not possible for a Catholic to remain orthodox if he denies one of these statements. And anathema in English means accursed. This is gnashing of teeth. This is weeping. This is the exterior darkness for those of us who accept these contrary teachings, contradictory teachings. And it was
Yes.
written in 1870. And this is sort of in the wake a few years after the publication of The Origin of Species. So if they're calling a council to deal with the errors of, at that time, sort of the post-French Revolutionary modern world, and they're addressing this error, it's very clear what this error is about. It's about the error of evolutionism that is infecting the populace. And we could go back to more councils, but this is important because this is one that people love to point to. When I say, for example, I disagree with John Paul II or Francis or something on some statement of evolution, they'll say, didn't you read Vatican I? The Pope is infallible, blah, 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 blah. And I say to myself, didn't you read Vatican I? Because that's not allowed.
Yeah.
And so these are not just our conjectural opinions about what we think is beautiful or good. This is clear magisterial authority.
Just 2 points about Vatican I think are very important. Number one, it is very important to recognize that in the tradition of the church, there are 2 kinds of ex nihilo creation. So there's what theologians call immediate ex nihilo creation. For example, when God creates the great light on day 1, it says fiat lux. There's no intermediate stage, there's nothing pre existing. God simply creates that light directly from nothing. And then there is creation ex nihilo that's mediated. So, for example, when God creates Adam's body, he takes pre existing matter that he's already created, the slime of the earth, and he supernaturally turns that into the body of the first man. But where many modern intellectuals go astray is that they say, well, because mediate creation ex nihilo involves the use of pre-existing matter, that somehow provides some kind of basis for theistic evolution. And it doesn't, because St. Thomas and all the fathers and doctors clearly teach that the matter has only what you would call an obediential potential to become whatever God wants it to be, and it's entirely passive. There was nothing in the slime of the earth that had any potential to become a human body. That's the point. It's only when God, by his supernatural, divine, creative action, acted upon that matter, that he then was able to turn it in to the body of a perfect man. So that's the first point. But the other thing that I think is very important to recall in regard to Vatican I is another anathema, where it says, if anyone says that the dogmas, that to the dogmas declared by the church, science, the progress of science should cause us to change any of the dogmas of the church as they have been taught or as they are now taught, let him be anathema. And the reason why this is so important in relation to the topic that we're discussing is, people will say to us, well, how do you know how the Pope and the fathers of Vatican I understood the dogma of creation at the moment that anathema was handed down? Well, the answer is simple. At the moment that anathema was handed down, the Pope mandated the Catechism of Trent to be used for teaching and preaching the dogmas of the faith all over the world. So we know exactly what the Council Fathers had in mind when they handed down that anathema. What they're saying is, if anyone says that the progress of science demands that we teach a different doctrine of creation than the one that is set forth in the Catechism of Trent, he comes under that anathema. Because what that anathema is saying is, there's nothing that natural scientists will ever learn that is true in astronomy, in geology, in biology, in any area of natural science that is ever going to contradict the dogma of creation as it is defined in the Catechism of the Council of Trent.
Yes, that's exactly it. And right now, I'm actually going to pull up quickly something that speaks to this from the Syllabus of Errors from Pius IX. And I'll just put that on the screen here. And it talks about what we're talking about. It uses the term human reason, but this is an acknowledgement of the exact same thing we're saying. So here it is on the screen. Number 5, divine revelation is imperfect and therefore subject to a continual and indefinite progress corresponding with the advancement of human reason. And when I used to be a high school teacher, I got myself in a lot of trouble, Hugh, because I was doing things like teaching my students the stuff that you guys put on your website. And I was actually a Catholic school teacher, which was interesting. Teaching Catholicism got me in trouble. But I was having a meeting with one of the chaplaincy leads, not really a chaplain, but these secular Catholic high schools. They have these they have these people that lead the religion departments. And
Yes.
at one point, they put this document out where they were trying to teach evolution as being Catholic. And I brought this to his attention from the Syllabus of Errors. And because he had said to me, well, the church has to get with the times. And I said, well, hold on a second. That's a condemned statement by Pius IX. And I showed him this. And the only thing he said to me was, Kennedy, you're creating for me quite a headache here. And I thought to myself, a headache? You're giving me a headache by teaching heresy. But anyway, so this is something that is nothing is new under the sun, as the scriptures tell us. These things have been thought about by people much smarter than myself and Hugh, and these things have been condemned in the past.
Yes. The other thing that I think is very interesting about Vatican I is that one of the things that Vatican I defined is that it is possible to know that God, the Creator, exists by the use of reason without revelation. And when the Fathers of Vatican I defined that truth, they specifically quote St. Paul's letter to the Romans, where he says, "From the beginning of creation, the invisible things of God have been clearly revealed in the things that he has made." Now, it's easy to pass over that and miss one of the very important ramifications of that statement. Because what are they talking about in that passage? They're talking about the fact that any human being, simply through the use of his unaided reason, can know that God, the Creator, exists. And in fact, we have nobody really has any excuse for not coming to that conclusion just from observing the things that we see in nature. But do you notice that in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, in the statement that is incorporated into that conciliar decree, is the clear teaching that man existed from the beginning of creation? Because it says that from the beginning of creation, man has been able to look at the created universe and to know from the design and the order in nature that there must be someone who designed and ordered the things that we see. So Vatican I is not only upholding the supernatural creation of all the different kinds of creatures, it's also upholding the chronology that was maintained and upheld and defended by every father and doctor of the church, which holds that God created everything at the beginning for us, and he did it less than 10,000 years ago. And that's why an ecumenical council, in a decree like the one that I just summarized, can say that from the beginning of creation, man was there, and he was able to know that there is a super intelligent divine creator just from looking at the universe that he created. And that's related to another point which I think is also very important because I know our time is flying. You know, we all recognize that at the time of Vatican I, Darwin had published his two major books. Um, Enlightenment philosophy had been percolating through Christendom for centuries, and this whole idea of long ages of time had become very fashionable in academia. But what many, many Catholics do not realize is that these ideas were not new. These ideas were spread throughout the Greco Roman pagan world in which the apostles and fathers of the church lived and operated. So when we hear people today say, well, the fathers didn't know anything about evolution, so they couldn't really address the topic, that is completely false. Anaximander, Epicurus, Lucretius were philosophers that had a very big following in the pagan world. And they were teaching that everything came to be through the same material processes that are going on now, and it took billions of years. Lucretius even came up with the idea of natural selection, that the way we have higher life forms, that there was this struggle for existence, and the more fit life forms prevail, and that's how you get the development of the higher life forms. So this idea of evolution through material processes and a struggle for existence over long ages of time, it is nothing new. And the fathers completely rejected these ideas in spite of the fact that they knew very well that the people who were propounding them were very intelligent, they were very learned, and they had a big following. So if it wasn't something that was important, they could have said, well, what's the big deal? Who cares when God created the world or if he used evolution? Let's just make peace with these people, and then we can have a bigger tent and bring in the intellectual leaders of the pagan world into the church. No father ever dreamed or took one tiny step in that direction. Every father of the church completely rejected all of these long age evolutionary fantasies. First of all, because they saw, being trained in philosophy as St. Basil and St. John Chrysostom and St. Gregory Nazianzen and most of the fathers were, they saw that in all these systems, the effect is greater than the cause. They're not metaphysically sound. But the main reason, if you read St. Ambrose and St. Basil and the fathers on creation, the main reason why they rejected these evolutionary hypotheses, which sound exactly like what Richard Dawkins and Carl Sagan have been preaching in our time, was because they were in obvious contradiction to what God himself revealed about how he created the world. From their point of view, if God tells you how he created the world when there were no human witnesses, and he tells you that it was entirely supernatural, so it's not going on any longer, it can't be observed, why would you throw away what God himself revealed to you about how he created the world to follow after some wild speculations of pagan, fallible philosophers? It made absolutely no sense to them, and it shouldn't make any sense to us.
Exactly. And I just put on the screen here something to that effect. This is talking about these errors from the ancient world. This is from the Fourth Lateran Council, and that's in around 1215. And at that point, the church was dealing with basically Albigensianism, which for Cole's notes, Albigensianism is essentially a resurrection of sort of the Manichaean Gnostic heresy of the first couple, 3, 4 centuries of the church, which St. Augustine dealt with. And it's one of my biggest pet peeves when people use St. Augustine to justify evolution, which I actually just finished narrating Anthony Esselin's translation of St. Augustine's Confessions for Tan. I had already read the book years ago, and everyone who's ever done audiobook narration knows that you read the book about 3 times through before it's done because you make so many mistakes back and forth, that sort of thing.
Right.
And so I've read that book word for word, I can tell you, at least 4 times. And nowhere in that book does St. Augustine espouse anything like evolution. There's an apologetic to be made for that, which is found on your website about the literal meaning of Genesis and Augustine. And he was using a
Yes.
translation of the scriptures, which did not turn out to be the right one. Nonetheless, even in that, his exegesis of it, he comes to the conclusion that creation was instantaneous and took less than 6 days, which I don't know how they square that into an evolutionary round, square peg round hole analogy. I don't know how they do that. But here is a resurrection of what had happened under Augustine's time, and this statement here from the Magisterium was God, creator of all visible and invisible things, of the spiritual and of the corporeal, who by his own omnipotent power at once from the beginning of time created each creature from nothing, spiritual and corporeal, namely angelic and mundane, and finally the human, constituted as it were alike of the spirit and body. This is almost verbatim what is the statement that is made at Vatican I, and it just shows you the consistency of the Church's magisterial teachings against the errors of this sort of error.
Yes, I'm so glad that you mentioned Lateran IV and the Firmiter Decree that you just quoted, because this is the most authoritative dogmatic decree on creation in the history of the Church. Nobody disputes that, but it's very sad that today, even I would say most theologians who are trying to be faithful to the tradition of the Church will say that all that Lateran IV defined is that God created some matter and he created the angels. It's not saying anything more than that. And these people from the Kolbe Center who are trying to tell us that Lateran IV was intended to mean that God created at the beginning all the different kinds of plants and animals and the human body, human beings, they're just completely out of line. Well, there's some very important information that I'm going to share now as we get to the end of our time. And I hope that our viewers and readers, listeners, will go to our website and read the article there on Lateran IV. It's entitled Lateran IV in its historical context excludes theistic evolution, because it goes into a lot more detail than I will have the time to go into now. But what this council was convened to oppose, the main heresy that Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council to condemn, was, as Kennedy said, the Albigensian heresy. And what many people don't realize is that St. Dominic and St. Francis were present at the Fourth Lateran Council. And St. Dominic founded the Dominican order initially to combat the Albigensian heresy. He had no intention originally of founding a congregation, but he went on a mission with his bishop, which took them through the south of France. And there they encountered these Albigensian heretics who had pretty much taken over the entire region with their false teaching. And they were absolutely appalled. And St. Dominic's bishop and St. Dominic tried to assist the local Orthodox clergy, especially the Cistercians, in combating this. And eventually, St. Dominic founded the Dominican congregation primarily, initially, to combat this heresy. But what were these Albigensian heretics actually teaching? Many people had the idea that they were teaching this kind of pure Manichaeanism, that God created the spiritual beings and Satan, or this evil principle, created the material creatures. That is not actually the case. If you study the history, you'll find that what many of the Albigensians were teaching was that God created the spiritual beings and the material elements, but then it was Satan who took those material elements and formed the different kinds of plants and animals and the human body. Now, think about that. That error was the object, the condemnation of that error was one of the primary purposes of the Fourth Lateran Council. And that firmitaire decree that Kenny, that you just read, was designed to condemn, to exclude that error. So it makes no sense to believe today that all that that decree was meant to say was, well, God created some matter and the angels, because that's what most of the Albigensians believed. So if that was what the Council Fathers meant to say, it makes absolutely no sense. No, what they were defining is that God himself created every kind of angel, because according to scholastic theology and philosophy, every angel is its own species, right?
That's right.
But simultaneously, it's saying that he created every kind of corporeal creature. That means every kind of plant, every kind of animal, and the first humans, body and soul. That's what it's teaching. That's what it has to be teaching, or it wouldn't be a refutation of Albigensianism. And if you read what the Albigensians were teaching and what Saint Dominic and his fellow preachers were preaching, they're preaching that God created all the different kinds of corporeal creatures, and he created man body and soul, that the human body is good, that holy marriage is good. And yet, who are the principal promoters of so-called Thomistic evolution? The Dominicans.
That's right.
Thanks be to God, there are exceptions, like the wonderful Dominican theologian, Father Thomas Crean, who has a fantastic article on our website on the perfection of our first parents. But let's face it, Dominican theologians and Dominicans with a background in natural science, are the foremost promoters of theistic evolution today.
Yeah.
And yet it is a total uh, deviation from what Saint Dominic founded the Dominican order to combat. He founded the Dominican order to defend the traditional teaching as we have defined it, and as it was defined later in the Catechism of Trent. And uh, the Thomistic evolutionists argue that Saint Thomas actually provides this wonderful basis in his writings for the reconciliation of evolution with the Catholic faith. And they will point to, among other things, question 73, where St. Thomas talks about the first perfection of the universe, which he defines as the completeness of the universe at its first founding. But what the Thomistic evolutionists are doing is they're saying, well, see, St. Thomas is saying that everything was there in the beginning to develop over 13.7 billion years into everything that now exists. That's not what he's saying at all. Anybody can read question 73 in context and see that St. Thomas is saying something totally different. He's defining the first perfection of the universe as the completeness of the universe, in the sense that every kind of creature existed, each one perfect according to its nature, all existing together with man and for man in perfect harmony at the very beginning of the world. That is what St. Thomas is teaching. And if somebody wants to disagree, please go and read the section of the Summa Logica Part 1 on creation, and then please contact me and show me how I'm wrong in how I interpreted his answer to question 73. St. Thomas is upholding the literal historical truth of Genesis 1 to 11 just as much, if not more, than every other father and doctor of the church. Even when it comes to the meaning of day in Genesis 1, you can look it up. He's very respectful of St. Augustine, who was relying on an imperfect translation of the Hebrew text of Genesis into Latin, the Vetus Latina, which made it seem that there would be a contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 if the days of Genesis were sequential 24-hour days. So, knowing that there couldn't be any error in the Bible whatsoever, he proposes this idea of an instantaneous creation that was revealed to the angels in these 6 installments that correspond to the days of creation. But St. Thomas, after giving St. Augustine a respectful hearing, comes down firmly on the side of the overwhelming majority view of the fathers and doctors. He says that Moses says there was evening and there was morning one day, because he's defining what a day in Genesis 1 is, which is 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness. So St. Thomas himself comes down definitively on the side of the overwhelming majority view of all the fathers and doctors of the church. And there's no doubt that if St. Augustine had been working from St. Jerome's Vulgate translation, where the apparent contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 disappears, then he would certainly have adhered to the overwhelming majority view on that point, just as he agreed with them on the literal and obvious historical truth of every other statement in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Now, before we leave this subject, and I know our time is running out, there's one other really, really important thing that I need to bring out. Because we have been criticized, for example, in the pages of The Wanderer, for claiming that Lateran IV, as intended by Pope Innocent III and the Council Fathers, teaches that God supernaturally created all the different kinds of corporeal creatures, all the different kinds of plants and animals, and the first human beings, our first parents, at the very beginning of creation. And the argument is made against us again and again. If these people from the Kolbe Center knew what they were talking about, then at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, when the traditional Orthodox theologians were trying to fight modernism, we would find people citing Lateran IV against evolution. But we don't see that. So obviously, the Kolbe Center people don't know what they're talking about. Well, I will admit, Kennedy, that for many years, this was somewhat perplexing for us because we could see that the greatest commentators on Lateran IV, like St. Lawrence of Brindisi, the last doctor of the church to write a detailed commentary on Genesis, interpret Lateran IV clearly as teaching exactly what I said, that God created all the different kinds of creatures at the beginning of creation. And for St. Lawrence, that's the 6 24-hour days. But you know what we eventually realized is that the reason why we don't find theologians, Orthodox Catholic theologians, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century citing Lateran IV against evolution, against modernism, is because right up to the time of St. Pius X, every Orthodox Catholic theologian considered that the sacred history of Genesis was true. So that was the source of our doctrine with regard to creation, and it was totally unnecessary to cite Lateran IV or Vatican I. And if you want a proof of what I'm saying, Matthias Schieben was one of the leading traditional Orthodox Catholic theologians at the end of the 19th century. and his work on dogmatic theology was translated into English and used in English-speaking seminaries. But when Matthias Schieben sets forth the dogma of creation, he says that evolution is false, that we know that God created all the different kinds of creatures by willing them into existence according to these divine ideas that existed in the mind of God. And he says this doctrine is most clearly explained in Genesis. Now, Matthias Schieben was writing very shortly after Vatican I, but he doesn't cite Vatican I because that's not the source of the doctrine. All that Vatican I did was to repeat what Lateran IV said. And all that Lateran IV was doing was to take what God revealed in Genesis and sum it up in very precise language. But St. Thomas would never have dreamed of citing Lateran IV as the source of his doctrine on creation. He goes to Genesis. And if Genesis says that Adam lived to be 930 years, that settles it. If Genesis says that there was a flood that covered all the earth's highest mountains, it was a global flood. End of discussion. The fathers and doctors would have considered it completely out of just incomprehensible that any Orthodox Catholic theologian would require something more than the testimony of the sacred history of Genesis to establish the truth of any of the facts that Moses sets forth. And I want to give one final proof that what I'm saying is true. St. Thomas wrote the Summa very soon after the Fourth Lateran Council. And as many of our viewers know, the Fourth Lateran Council was the first ecumenical council to define transubstantiation. So when St. Thomas writes the Summa and he explains transubstantiation, of course, he cites Lateran IV, right? Wrong. He doesn't even mention Lateran IV. All he does is to cite Holy Scripture and the Fathers. You see, we have lost the piety. We have lost the soul of our fathers in the faith. It is almost extinguished among us, the reverence that they had for the Word of God. And that is the reason why we cannot point to a lot of magisterial decrees or conciliar statements that explicitly uphold the literal historical truth of Genesis 1 to 11, because until very recently, it was totally unnecessary, because every father and doctor of the church, including St. Augustine, would have shed his last drop of blood for the literal historical truth of every word in the sacred history of Genesis.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and I think like every good Catholic sermon, it's good to end with Our Lady. And the Dominicans were founded, as you said, for this problem of Albigensian, primarily of Albigensianism. And St. Dominic is where we have our rosary that we know it today, the Dominican rosary that is the most common in the Western Catholic Church, the Latin Church. And Our Lady gave St. Dominic the mysteries. And when Our Lady came to reveal the Immaculate Conception, she said to St. Bernadette, I am the Immaculate Conception. Not I'm immaculately conceived, not, Adam and Eve were also immaculately conceived, but I'm the really special one. It's a unique thing in history for a human being who is not God and God and man. I am the Immaculate Conception. If Adam and Eve were from some sort of hominid creatures and had their souls infused, then because they would have necessarily had to have been conceived without sin. So there would have been no speciality to the Immaculate Conception of Our Lady. So this, just like all heresies about the nature of Christ, the Christology, we have to defend the Mariology. This is defending against Nestorianism, etc. So ultimately, this evolutionary hoax, this problem, will ultimately be an attack on our Blessed Mother, which I think offends God as much or more than anything. Um, Hugh,
Could
why
I
don't you?
make one last point
Sure, yeah, no, no
on
problem.
that
Yeah,
subject?
yeah,
Uh, just very briefly, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And we know that Our Lady appeared at Fatima to warn us that if we didn't repent, Russia would spread her errors throughout the world. And what was the principal error that took hold in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution? It was not communism, it was evolutionism, because it was evolutionism, the belief, the false belief that science, the science of evolution, could explain the origins of man and the universe without God, that made confident atheist materialists of Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and the rest of their followers. Had it not been for the pseudoscience of evolution, those men would not have lost their faith, and we would be living in a very different world. The other point that I want to make is, what did Our Lady of Fatima tell every Catholic in the world to do? Practice the first Saturday devotions. But why is Saturday the special day of Our Lady? And if you go back in the tradition of the church, especially in the liturgical tradition of the church, you discover that it goes back to creation. Because when God created Adam and Eve, the mystical saints who were shown the work of creation, just as it was shown to Moses, like Saint Bridget of Sweden and Venerable Maria of Agreda, they tell us that Adam looked just like our Lord Jesus Christ, and Eve looked just like the Blessed Virgin Mary, because they were the prototypes of the perfect man and the perfect woman from before the foundation of the world. So when God finished creating the world, what was the last thing that he created? It was Eve. And in the office of the Bridgetine Sisters, which is derived from the writings of St. Bridget of Sweden, Doctor of the Church, there is this beautiful prayer that is still prayed by the Bridgetines all over the world, which sums up one of the wonderful insights of the fathers and doctors of the church, which is that when God finished creating this world, it was, as St. Thomas says, perfect. Everything was created perfect according to its nature. Everything was in perfect harmony. There was no human death. There was no deformity. There was no disease. And yet, St. Bridget says in the prayers of her office that the one thing that was more beautiful than this entire creation, when it came forth from God in the beginning on the seventh, and was he rested in it on the seventh day, which was Saturday, is what? Is the Blessed Virgin Mary. So if somebody were to intrude into your studio right now and say, oh no, the Blessed Virgin Mary, she was a woman like anybody else, she had her failings, we would immediately set this person straight for the honor and glory of God, of the Blessed Virgin, and for the good of this poor misguided soul. And yet, we pay people good money in most of our Catholic schools, universities, and seminaries to teach our own people that God created the world full of death,
yeah.
deformity, disease, and used a process of hundreds of millions of years of death, deformity, disease, and destruction to produce the human beings that he finally wanted to create. That's a blasphemy.
It is.
And that's why we say atheistic evolution turns men into demons. That's what it did with Lenin and Stalin, who were born into Orthodox Christian homes. But theistic evolution makes a demon out of God.
Mhm.
So we honor Saturday as Our Lady's Day because the perfection of the entire universe on the first Saturday of the world was only surpassed by the beauty, the goodness, and the perfection of our Immaculate Mother. And so when we practice the first Saturday devotions, we should call that to mind.
That's beautiful. And despite the technical glitches we've had in this stream, which is always the case when we talk about these topics, there has been one miracle. For the first time in the history of the Kennedy Report, I think it's not my kids I can hear in the background, but it's the guests' grandchildren, which is usually my children upstairs making noise. But I think they're, my wife's homeschooling them or something like that, so they're quiet for now. Hugh, I thank you so much for coming on this show. I'm really excited. We're going to do, I think, 4 episodes together throughout this series, and this is so fascinating. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a podcast you're going to want to listen to again and again and again. And just so everyone knows, I also do put the podcast on my Substack, where there's extra goodies if people want to sign up for premium subscriber. There's certain things that I can't say on YouTube. YouTube's better than it was during the COVID regime, but it's still far from perfect. So there's certain things I like to say over there if you like a hot take here and there. And also, if you do just like the audio, some people like to listen on podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, whatever. Everything is there as well. So make sure you check those things out as well. And Hugh, everyone should go and maybe add to this, but go to the kolbecenter.org. This is an organization that runs off of your generosity. And is there a place there where they can sort of, find a way to financially support your endeavors?
Oh, sure. There's a donation button right on the homepage. And we also have a website, foundationsrestore.com, where you can watch the first 2 episodes of our DVD series for free. And I highly recommend that you watch those if you've never done so before.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, go to the link. I'll put the link for the Kolbe Center and for Foundations Restored in the show notes for this podcast, so you can find that easily. As always, ladies and gentlemen, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. And until next time, God bless you all.